Welcome, wee ones, to Scottish Murders. Dawn will shortly be taking you through a solved or unsolved murder involving people from or living in Scotland. So get ready to hear about the darker side of bonnie Scotland.
The town of Johnston is located, according to Wikipedia, in the west central lowlands of Scotland and 12 miles or 19 kilometres west of Glasgow city centre. There are many woods in Johnston where people can enjoy a walk or a hike or just enjoy some fresh air and peace and quiet. One such woods are Rannoch Woods, which are about a 15-minute walk south of Johnston city centre, and there are multiple paths you can take through these woods, which also has the addition of a children's play area near the middle. Rannoch Woods is surrounded on all sides by roads, and one entrance and exit to the woods takes you to and from a housing scheme. Back in 1981, not only were these woods enjoyed by many to walk in, they were also frequented by some as a place to take drugs or have sex, as well as where one local man used to frequently flash at the locals. Rannoch Woods were also used as a shortcut by children who lived in the housing scheme who went to St Cuthbert's High School, which was located about a 25-minute walk west of the housing scheme. One girl who regularly used the woods as a shortcut to and from St Cuthbert's High School was 16-year-old Pamela Hastie. Pamela lived with her mum Christine and her dad James. Pamela's mum was a devout Catholic, and Pamela went to St Cuthbert's High School, which was an all-girls Catholic school, where the uniform was a black blazer with white braiding. Pamela was described in the programme Trial and Error as a lovely, polite, friendly girl who was more interested in her studies than she was in boys, with her headmaster saying in an article in the Press and Journal newspaper on the 6th of November 1981 that she was an intelligent, well-mannered young lady, and she was a bright, hard-working pupil. Pamela had also just become a prefect at school, and she was so happy and proud about this, as were her parents. Pamela also enjoyed playing netball and volleyball at school, and was a keen pianist. In her spare time, she collected for Help the Aged and the Disabled, with her headmaster going on to say that she was a credit to her parents and the school. Wednesday, the 4th of November 1981, had just been like any other day for Pamela Hastie. She had spent her day at school, taking part in various activities, before leaving at her usual time of 3 p.m. and walking her usual route home, which included her usual walk through Rannoch Woods, and the path she chose took her almost into the centre of the woods, but brought her pretty much out at her front door. On this day, however, Pamela was alone. It was November in Scotland, so it was likely a bit cold and starting to get dark, so Pamela was likely walking at a good pace. So much so that about 3:30 p.m. she was almost out of the woods, almost home. However, that would be as far as Pamela would get before she was attacked. When Pamela didn't return home, and none of her friends had seen her since she had left school at 3 p.m. to walk home, her parents began to worry, and so went to the woods and walked along the path Pamela would have taken to get home. However, when there was no sign of Pamela, her parents called the police. The police and locals began searching Rannoch Woods, despite the cold weather and now completely dark woods. And about 3 a.m. on the morning of Thursday the 5th of November, about 12 hours since Pamela had last been seen, a police officer came across Pamela's body, only a few hundred yards or metres from her home. Pamela's body had been partly covered and hidden by undergrowth, with one of the senior officers saying that this was a disgusting killing. Immediately, the area was cordoned off, and a full forensic examination and massive murder inquiry began. But what had happened to Pamela? Well, according to an article in the Press and Journal newspaper on the 6th of November, Pamela had been bludgeoned and left for dead, having been dragged into the bushes, and that the police were looking for the murder weapon, which was believed to be a blunt instrument. While the detective leading the murder inquiry, Detective Superintendent James Brown, said that he was satisfied that sex had been the motive for murder, he would not confirm if Pamela had been sexually assaulted. However, following Pamela's post-mortem, it was confirmed that she had been raped and had been strangled to death. While the police investigation to find Pamela's brutal murderer continued, Pamela's distraught family had the desperately sad task of holding her funeral. The funeral was attended by the police, as well as 2 students from each class at Pamela's school, who all wore their distinctive black blazers with white braiding, as a mark of respect to Pamela and her family, as Pamela had been wearing her uniform when she was brutally murdered, before Pamela was then laid to rest. With the police having attended Pamela's funeral and no one having drawn their suspicions there, they turned their focus elsewhere. About 2 hours before Pamela had last been seen alive, an anonymous call had been made to the police by a female advising them that a man had been exposing himself to people near Rannoch Woods. This was not the first time the police had heard about a male exposing themselves to young girls and females in and around Rannoch Woods. It had apparently been happening for some time, with many in the area knowing exactly who the flasher was. And so it didn't take the police long to track down this man. 19-year-old Raymond Gilmour lived with his mum, Christine, and 2 brothers, David and Gordon, in the same housing estate as Pamela and her family, and so Raymond had likely known of Pamela. When Raymond was not flashing in or near Rannoch Woods, he worked behind the counter at the nearby petrol station. Despite most people having known for some time that Raymond was a flasher, his mother, Christine, didn't find out until one day her brother told her that Raymond had been flashing her brother's friend's wee daughter, and that the girl's father had gone to the police. Christine was shocked by this, but upon Raymond being confronted by his uncle, he admitted to this and was subsequently charged by the police. And so following Pamela's murder and the police being made aware of the anonymous phone call about a male exposing himself near Rannoch Woods, the police had a feeling this man had been Raymond. And so on Saturday, the 7th of November, 2 days after Pamela had been found, he was brought into Johnston Police Station for questioning, to which he eventually admitted to at least 40 indecent exposure acts over a 2-year period. However, he denied any involvement in Pamela's murder. Following Raymond's confession to the indecent exposure acts, detectives went to Raymond's home that he shared with his mum and brothers to carry out a search of Raymond's bedroom, and what was found only served to further convince the detectives of Raymond's involvement in Pamela's murder. They had found pornographic magazines and a bag of sex aids. Not overly damning, however, pornographic magazines had also been found in plastic bags in Rannoch Woods following a search being carried out, along with blank receipts from the local petrol station where sexual fantasy stories had been written in Raymond's handwriting. And the police believed that all of these items put together indicated a man very interested in sex, and the police had already stated that they believed the motive for Pamela's murder had been sexual in nature. Following these findings, Raymond was interviewed again in relation to Pamela's murder, but again he denied any involvement. And so, on Monday the 9th of November, the lead detective working on Pamela's murder investigation, Detective Superintendent James Brown, interviewed Raymond again, along with 2 detectives that had been drafted in from the Serious Crime Squad, Detective Sergeant Mayer and Detective Constable Love. But again, Raymond denied any involvement in Pamela's murder, and only admitted to the indecent exposure. Fed up with Raymond, Detective Superintendent James Brown asked the 2 Serious Crime Squad detectives to take him back to the cells, and it was during the journey back to the cells that the 2 detectives said that Raymond finally broke down, saying he couldn't go on like this, and that he had to talk, before giving the 2 detectives a full account of Pamela's murder. The 2 detectives quickly had a statement written out to the same effect, and according to the programme Trial and Error, Raymond even provided a handwritten map of the scene of the crime. The statement said that Raymond had hit Pamela over the head repeatedly with a 2-foot length of branchwood, before strangling her with either her tie or the strap of her bag. Surprised but delighted by Raymond's sudden admission of murdering Pamela, Detective Superintendent James Brown interviewed Raymond again, with Detectives Mayer and Love also present, as he was concerned that there had been some inconsistencies in Raymond's account. Detective Superintendent James Brown asked Raymond where he had left Pamela's body, asked him what Pamela had been wearing, what he had hit Pamela with, and what he had strangled Pamela with. And after Raymond had answered these questions, Detective Superintendent James Brown was satisfied that Raymond was not Pamela's killer. Raymond was then taken to Long Rig End Prison to await his trial for the indecent exposure offences, which was to take place on Tuesday the 9th of February 1982. 3 months had passed since Pamela had been so brutally murdered, and despite the ongoing murder investigation and the police making numerous appeals, they were still no further forward in finding her killer. But that was just about to change. 2 detectives from the Serious Crime Squad, Detective Chief Inspector Corey and Detective Sergeant Blair, collected Raymond from Long End Prison, as apparently Raymond was under some sort of protective custody, on the morning of the 9th of February, with the intention of driving him to his trial 40 minutes away in Paisley Sheriff Court. However, en route, Raymond spontaneously again confessed to Pamela Hastie's murder, and so instead was taken to Paisley Police Station, where a full statement could be taken, as both detectives had deemed that this took precedence over his trial for indecent exposure. However, instead of approximately 40 minutes having lapsed from Raymond having been picked up at the prison and taken to Paisley, 3 hours had actually passed from Raymond being picked up at the prison and arriving at Paisley Police Station. It was never explained why it had taken an extra 2 hours and 20 minutes for them to have covered a 40-minute journey, and especially it was not disclosed what had taken place in this extra time. However, upon Raymond and the 2 detectives arriving at Paisley Police Station, Raymond was immediately taken into an interview room, where he again was questioned regarding Pamela's murder by Detective Superintendent Charles Craig and Detective Sergeant Mayer, with it being Detective Sergeant Mayer that Raymond had supposedly confessed to previously on his way back to a police cell. When Raymond was asked if he had murdered Pamela, he had apparently said that he had, but that he didn't know why, just that he had to keep her quiet, believing that he had used her tie or strap from her bag to strangle her. And so that was it. Raymond was charged with Pamela's murder and sent back to prison to await his murder trial, which took place in June 1982. Now, in Scottish law, there needs to be a corroboration of evidence, meaning that Raymond couldn't be found guilty on his statements given to the police alone, especially as neither of his statements were signed, and Raymond was saying that one had been forced out of him by the police, and the second he never made at all. However, there was corroborative evidence provided at his trial. Firstly, Raymond was a known flasher, which had been made known to the jury, and he'd been seen flashing near Rannoch Woods the very day Pamela had been murdered. There were also the pornographic magazines found in his bedroom, as well as similar ones found in Rannoch Woods. There were the sex aids found in his bedroom. There were the sexual fantasy stories found written in Raymond's handwriting on the back of blank receipts from his place of work, which had been found in Rannoch Woods. There was also the branch of wood that had been used to hit Pamela over the head, and there was also a witness who testified that she had been startled by a man in Rannoch Woods near the path Pamela would have taken about 30 minutes before Pamela had herself walked through the woods, and she claimed that the man she had seen was Raymond Gilmour. Despite Raymond submitting a defensive alibi, saying that he was somewhere else at the time of the murder, here was a witness who placed him at the scene of the crime about 30 minutes before Pamela was murdered. And so with all this corroborative evidence mounted against Raymond, it didn't take the jury long to deliver a verdict of guilty. And there you have it. Just like that, Raymond was sentenced to life. Another murderer off the streets, you might say. However, what if all the corroborative evidence that had definitely led to Raymond being convicted had been coerced, was untrue, or had been misinterpreted? And what if important evidence that could have helped Raymond had been withheld? Now, I'm going to tell you exactly what happened along the way that led to Raymond Gilmour being wrongly convicted of Pamela Hastie's murder. While Raymond Gilmour had been indecently exposing himself to women and young girls, and he had been charged with this offence, on Monday the 9th of November 1981, he had not, or at least not willingly, admitted to being Pamela Hastie's murderer. According to Raymond, upon being taken back to the police cells by Crime Squad detectives Mayer and Love, the 2 detectives had coerced him into making a statement that he was Pamela's murderer. Exactly how he had been coerced, I'll leave up to your imagination. However, according to the innocenceproject.org, it wouldn't be until 1984 before the UK law known as the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, or PACE, was passed, which included changes such as mandated audio recordings of all suspect interviews, the right to legal representation for suspects, and limits on detention before charge, amongst other things. Another glimpse into how Raymond may have been coerced into giving a false statement came from the trial and error programme, which spoke of other potential suspects of Pamela Hastie's murder before Raymond was charged, with many of the suspects being teenagers in 1981 who had never been involved with the police previously. They said that they weren't allowed a solicitor until the police decided, they weren't allowed to have breaks, but instead were questioned repeatedly for up to 12 to 14 hours at a time. The police were very aggressive, angry, and intimidating. They were threatened and shouted at, and there was physical abuse, to the point that they would have said anything to get it to stop, including being so close to admitting to Pamela's murder despite being completely innocent. Many of these young men were left scarred by their treatment from the police. However, you will remember that despite Raymond's supposed statement being made, following him being questioned again by Detective Superintendent James Brown, it was believed that Raymond was not Pamela's killer. So what had made Detective Superintendent James Brown come to this conclusion? Well, it had been Raymond's answers to his questions. When he had asked Raymond where he had left Pamela's body, Raymond had said that he had dragged Pamela's body about 30 feet or 9 meters off the path, but that she was still in full view of it. However, Pamela's body had actually been found about 200 feet or 61 meters from the path, and her body had been covered, so it wasn't seen easily from the path. Next, he had asked Raymond what Pamela had been wearing, to which Raymond had replied, a black blazer, grey skirt, black shoes, and white socks. However, Pamela had actually been wearing grey shoes and grey tights. And Raymond did live in the area, so he would have known that the girls at Pamela's school wore a black blazer. The detective then asked Raymond how he had killed Pamela, and Raymond had said he had hit Pamela repeatedly with a 2-foot length of branchwood, which had apparently rendered her unconscious, before strangling her with her tie or strap from her bag. However, Detective Superintendent James Brown had been at the post-mortem and had not seen any injuries to suggest Pamela had been hit over the head at all. No bruising was found. So, if suggested by the post-mortem results and by the pathologists who did the post-mortem, as well as Detective Superintendent James Brown, who had been present, that there had been no bruising to suggest that Pamela had been hit over the head at all, as Raymond had said, then why was a 2-foot length of branchwood provided as evidence at Raymond's murder trial, as having been the object that had rendered Pamela unconscious? Well, that would be because the pathologists who had carried out Pamela's post-mortem had noticed signs of petechial hemorrhaging and had added to the report that this was consistent with being struck with a blunt instrument, and they'd gone on to repeat this at the murder trial, which is why the 2-foot length of branchwood was provided as evidence at the murder trial, despite the pathologists and the detective who attended the post-mortem not having seen any signs of bruising to Pamela's face or scalp. However, petechial hemorrhaging is in fact consistent with manual strangulation, hanging or smothering, but at the trial, the 2 pathologists testified that they were absolutely convinced by the petechial hemorrhaging that a blow had been delivered to Pamela's head that was powerful enough to have rendered her unconscious. How could the pathologists have got it so wrong? Just as an aside note, leading forensic pathologist Professor Ian West was asked by the investigators from Trial and Error who were looking into Raymond's case to give his opinion on the original post-mortem results. And Professor Ian West advised that from looking at the post-mortem results, there was no evidence to suggest that Pamela had been hit over the head at all. His only thoughts on why the pathologists at the time were convinced Pamela had been hit over the head was maybe because any bruising to Pamela's scalp or face had not been correctly reported in the post-mortem results. But why would it not have been recorded by the pathologists? And why was no bruising seen by Detective Superintendent James Brown, who attended the post-mortem? And then there was what Pamela had been strangled with. While Raymond told Detective Superintendent James Brown he had apparently strangled Pamela with her tie or bag strap, Pamela had actually been strangled with a length of twine, which had been found wrapped 3 times around her neck. And so that was how the Detective Superintendent had come to the conclusion in 1981 that Raymond was not Pamela's killer. He had no idea what had really happened to her, only what he had read in the newspapers. and what exactly had happened in February 1982, 3 months after Pamela's murder, that made Raymond suddenly apparently confess to Pamela's murder again, which led to him this time being charged and convicted. Well, I'll get to that, but first, the items that had apparently been found in Raymond's bedroom that had cemented in the minds of certain detectives that he was really interested in sex and was definitely Pamela's killer. So there had been the pornographic magazines and the sex aids. So what had really happened that day at Raymond's home was that Raymond's mum, Christine, and Raymond's 2 brothers, David and Gordon, had been told to stay downstairs while the detectives searched Raymond's bedroom. When they came down the stairs with the magazines and the sex aids, the detectives were delighted with their findings from Raymond's bedroom. Except the sex aids hadn't been found in Raymond's bedroom. They actually belonged to his brother Gordon, and they had been in his bedroom. The police had also been told that all 3 of the brothers used the pornographic magazines, not just Raymond. They were all young lads doing young lad things. Obviously, Raymond had been going a step further, though. But this story didn't work for the detectives, who so desperately wanted to catch Pamela's killer, and so they went with a slightly different version that these items had all been found in Raymond's bedroom. And while Raymond had admitted that the blank receipts found in the woods with sexual fantasy stories written on them did belong to him, which by the way were found on completely the other side of the woods to where Pamela was found, the police were misleading when saying that the pornographic magazines found in Raymond's room were similar to the ones found in clear plastic bags in Rannoch Woods, implying that they too belonged to Raymond, when in actual fact there was absolutely nothing that tied the magazines found in the woods to Raymond. They could have belonged to anyone. Okay, so back to February 1982, 3 months after Pamela had been murdered. While Raymond was being driven to his indecent exposure trial, he apparently confessed again to Pamela's murder, despite Detective Superintendent Brown being convinced he was not their killer. Well, what had changed in these 3 months was that local Detective Superintendent Brown had been removed from the case and replaced with Detective Superintendent Charles Craig from the Serious Crime Squad from out of town. And what wasn't known to the public at the time was that Detective Superintendent Charles Craig had a 100% clean-up record. And so he was not going to be letting the small fact that Raymond Gilmour may actually be innocent of Pamela's murder stand in his way of getting a conviction. Which leads me on to the 2 supposed statements given to the police by Raymond, where Raymond adamantly stated at his murder trial and afterwards that he was coerced into giving the first statement by police officers and that he never gave the second one at all, with neither statement ever being signed. Well, again, in the Trial and Error programme, which aired in 1994, where it was investigated whether Raymond had indeed suffered a miscarriage of justice, experts in their fields were sought to give their opinions. And through this, it was established by a forensic psychologist that on the map of the crime scene that Raymond had apparently provided to the police, 2 other people, as well as Raymond, had taken turns to draw and write details on the map. Now, was Raymond not able to compile a map of the crime scene that he had apparently created himself, or were the detectives in attendance that were interviewing Raymond just lending him a helping hand, just to ensure that the details on the map were absolutely correct? Now we'll turn to the forensic evidence, or lack thereof, which was investigated by forensic scientist Professor Angela Gallup on the Trial and Error programme. While there was absolutely no forensic evidence that connected Raymond to Pamela, what had been found on Pamela's blouse was a microscopic flake of paint. And apparently Raymond had been sanding down his car on the day of Pamela's murder, and so the police jumped on this flake of paint as belonging to Raymond. However, in 1994, when forensic scientist Dr. Angela Gallup was asked to look over the forensic evidence from Raymond's case, she was very concerned. As Raymond had been sanding down his car that day, and as a severe struggle had taken place between Pamela and her killer, Dr. Gallup said she would definitely have expected, had Raymond been her killer, that there would have been a lot more forensic evidence than one microscopic fleck of paint. Raymond's mother backed this up by saying she had come home later on the same day Raymond had been sanding his car and found him sitting on the couch, still wearing the same clothes as when he'd sanded his car, and she said that there was flecks and paint absolutely everywhere. So it's not really looking like this microscopic fleck of paint was anything to do with Raymond, so why was it there in Pamela's blouse? Did it come from her real killer? While only a microscopic fleck of paint had been found on Pamela's blouse, other potential forensic evidence had been found near Pamela's body, although it looked like this had also been overlooked. Professor Gallup reported in an article in the Daily Record newspaper on the 31st of March 2019 that a photograph had been taken of a footwear mark that had been found on the ground near Pamela's school books by a police officer. However, despite this shoe print potentially being a vital clue and could certainly have been compared to Raymond's footwear, no attempt to do this had been made. Only a photograph had been taken before being forgotten about. Also, 3 hairs had been found on the branch of a tree at the scene, which apparently had been Pamela's. But along with the hairs had also been a purple nylon fibre. If this fibre had been associated with the hairs, and assuming it hadn't come from Pamela's clothing, then this could have come from Pamela's attacker. However, again, having collected this piece of fibre, it had then been forgotten about, instead of being used for comparison purposes or forensic testing. Then there was the twine that had been used to strangle Pamela. While Raymond had said in both his confessions that he had used either Pamela's tie or the strap from her bag to strangle her and never once mentioned twine, but because Pamela was actually strangled using twine, the police set out to prove that the twine found around Pamela's neck had belonged to Raymond. Apparently, while Raymond was at work, he and his manager had opened a delivery that had arrived, and that delivery had been wrapped in similar twine that had been found around Pamela's neck. And that was it. The police were determined that both pieces of twine were one and the same. However, the 2 pieces of twine were never sent off for tests for comparison. It was just determined by the police on site that that's what Raymond had used. But that wasn't all the investigators for the trial and error program uncovered. They had uncovered a witness that suggested there had been another man other than Raymond loitering in Rannoch Woods in the days leading up to Pamela's murder as well as the day off. Although this witness had appeared at Raymond's trial in 1982 and had categorically pointed to Raymond as being Pamela's killer. Pauline Bain had been a 16-year-old schoolgirl back in 1981, and she had also used Rannoch Woods as a shortcut. On the day of the murder, Pauline had left school early as she had a dentist appointment, and as usual, she used the shortcut through Rannoch Woods to reach her home. As I mentioned at the beginning, Rannoch Woods has many paths winding through it, and on this occasion, Pauline had walked on a path very close to the one Pamela Hastie would walk on a mere 30 minutes later. As Pauline had been walking through the woods, she suddenly heard something and stopped before glancing round to see if she could see anything. And she did. It was a man standing not too far away from her in the bushes, just staring back at her. Pauline got such a fright that she ran all the way home and told her parents when she got there. They immediately took Pauline to the police station to report it. Now, the day before Pamela's murder, Pauline had been walking through Rannoch Woods again, this time with her 14-year-old friend, and this time they were on a path that was quite a distance from where she would see the man standing staring at her the very next day. This path was near to the road, which was close to the area where Raymond had been known to flash at people. While both of the girls had been walking on this path, they were shocked when they had been accosted by a man exposing himself. This incident was reported to the police, and with the description of the man and what he'd been wearing been given by the girls, the man was soon identified as being Raymond. And upon being questioned, Raymond did admit that yes, it was him who'd exposed himself to the 2 young girls on the day before Pamela's murder. Now this is when things get a bit mixed up. As it had been determined that it had been Raymond the girls had seen on the day before Pamela's murder, it was also assumed that it had been Raymond Pauline had seen staring at her on the day of Pamela's murder, and very close to the path that Pamela would have taken, and therefore Raymond must have been Pamela's killer. Now, apparently, Pauline's statement to the police at the time said that the man she had seen the day before Pamela's murder and the man she had seen the day of Pamela's murder were the same man, and Raymond had admitted that he was the man Pauline and her friend had seen the day before Pamela's murder. And Pauline said the same at Raymond's murder trial in 1982. However, upon being interviewed by Trial and Error when the programme was released in 1994, Pauline was now saying, 12 years later, that not only had the two sightings been in different locations in the woods, but that on the day of Pamela's murder, the man she had seen the day before, who had indecently exposed himself to her, was not the same man she had seen staring at her near the path Pamela took 30 minutes later, before being brutally raped and murdered. And Pauline also stated that she had told the police officers all this at the time of her making her statement back in 1981. But then why did she say the opposite at the murder trial? Well, Pauline was only 16 years old, so she would have been pretty intimidated by being a witness at a murder trial, so it was suggested that maybe she had just got confused. However, Pauline was absolutely adamant that it had been two different men she had seen, and so she had agreed to give a precognition saying as much to Raymond's solicitor. However, Pauline had something else to add too, something very interesting indeed. A few days before Pamela had been murdered, Pauline and the same girl she had been with when Raymond had exposed himself had both again been walking through Rannoch Woods when they were both grabbed from behind and dragged off the path. Thankfully, both girls managed to escape and ran home, but not before they got a good look at their attacker. They told the police that this man had been tall, with shoulder-length red hair, and that he had a knife. Now, the fact that this man was carrying a knife is extremely interesting when something else that had been missed from Pamela's post-mortem report was discovered again by those brought in to investigate the case for the Trial and Error programme. And I'll get to that, but first, another witness had come forward regarding someone who had been staying at their bed and breakfast, which was located near Rannoch Woods. However, this person didn't come forward with this information at the time of the investigation. Instead, they waited 13 years, only coming forward after being interviewed for the Trial and Error programme. This witness said that regularly she had lorry drivers staying with her at her bed and breakfast, and at the time of Pamela's murder, she had a male staying with her who had long red wavy hair, and it just so happened that on the day Pamela was found, he was acting very strangely, and by the following week he had cut his long hair completely off. She went on to say that she found out much later that apparently this man had been sent to prison for sexual offences against his young daughter and niece. And then there was the final piece of evidence that the Trial and Error programme revealed that had been completely missed by everyone involved in Pamela's case back in 1981, had been completely overlooked until 1994. In the post-mortem report from 1981, it detailed defensive wounds, such as cuts and puncture wounds to both of Pamela's hands. The defensive wounds apparently were consistent and classic with Pamela having grabbed a knife blade as her attacker came towards her with it before the knife was pulled away violently by her attacker. However, despite the original pathologists reporting the defensive wounds on Pamela's hands, and these particular wounds being consistent with knife wounds, it was not stated anywhere in the report that a knife had been used. Not only had the pathologists failed to report what these findings might imply, but the detectives reading the report, including Detective Superintendent James Brown, also failed to pick up on what Pamela's hand wounds meant. You might be asking, so what? Well, do you remember what the schoolgirl Pauline had said when she and her friend had been walking through Rannoch Woods a few days before Pamela was murdered? She said that her and her friend had both been grabbed around the neck and dragged off the path, and that the man had red hair, but also that he had a knife. And this man was definitely not Raymond Gilmour, as Raymond had dark brown, close to black hair. However, despite this attack and the fact that a knife had been present was reported to the police, due to the fact that the pathologists had not stated what these defensive wounds meant, and the detectives not picking up on these apparent classic defensive wounds as being knife wounds, this red-haired man who had attacked two schoolgirls a few days before Pamela had been murdered was never sought, apparently having been completely overlooked. The Trial and Error programme contacted Detective Superintendent James Brown, and he stated that yes, he had completely overlooked what the pathologist's findings clearly stated, and that due to this, the attack on Pauline and her friend had never been connected to Pamela's murder. One other thing forensic psychologist Eric Shepherd had reported to the investigators of trial and error, having studied the documents in Raymond's case, was that he felt the police's anxiety to crack the case and Raymond's timid anxiety to please made a fatal combination. So, all of this new evidence sounded pretty damning, and if the defence and the jury had been aware of it at Raymond's murder trial, not only would any corroboration be out of the window, but it most likely would have rendered a very different outcome for Raymond. So now that all of this had been uncovered, surely Raymond would have his conviction quashed. Well, Raymond finally had his appeal granted in June 2001, which would have meant he had served 19 years behind bars for a crime he did not commit. However, Raymond would actually spend almost another year in prison before finally being released in April 2002. And he would not have his conviction quashed until August 2007, 25 years after having been found guilty of Pamela's murder. As you can imagine, Raymond had a very tough time behind bars. As it is well known, there is a very low tolerance for any actions that negatively involve children in prisons. And as Raymond had been habitually flashing young girls and had been convicted of murdering 16-year-old Pamela Hastie, then this could only mean a very unpleasant 19 years behind bars. In the Ferris conspiracy book by Paul Ferris and Reg Mackay, some of the torture Raymond Gilmour was subjected to is detailed, such as regular and systematic beatings lasting days at a time, being badly scalded on numerous occasions, and having rat droppings mixed in with his food. Not only was Raymond having a tough time in prison, he was also having a tough time having any of his appeals accepted. The first appeal was lodged by Raymond's solicitor in 1983, but this was rejected by 3 judges in the Court of Criminal Appeal. Raymond's solicitor then took Raymond's case to the European Court of Human Rights, but it was also rejected here. A further 2 appeals were then lodged with the Secretary of State for Scotland in 1993 and 1996, but again both of these were rejected. That was even after one of the appeals had been lodged following the trial and error programme being aired, which had discovered so much more evidence that should have been enough for a review of his case to have been warranted. Now, while Raymond was having no luck with his appeals, according to the Herald newspaper, in February 1996, almost 14 years after being wrongly convicted, Raymond was attending a college on day release as part of his training for freedom. Although this was very short-lived, as in April of the same year, Raymond appeared at Edinburgh Sheriff Court on the charge of exposing himself to 5 women and girls whilst on his day release to college. Raymond admitted to 4 of the charges of indecency, which involved 2 14-year-olds, 1 15-year-old, and 2 women in their late 20s. He was sentenced to 3 months. At this time, a spokesperson for the Scottish Prison Service said that Raymond would have been offered sex counselling during his sentence for the murder of Pamela Hastie, as anyone convicted of crimes of that nature would be offered counselling and support. However, in an article in the Guardian newspaper on the 31st of August 2007, Raymond's mum, Christine, and his solicitor, Gordon Ritchie, who had taken up Raymond's case in 1993, both claimed that Raymond's sexual inadequacy was never treated because he would not admit to killing Pamela. It wouldn't be until the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission was established in 1995 that finally Raymond would have a chance of having his appeal accepted. But his appeal to try and prove his innocence would not be granted until June 2001. So why was Raymond not released on parole until April 2002, almost a year after his appeal had been granted? Well, it was again due to his insistence that he was innocent that had caused him not to be considered for parole. It wasn't until a judge ruled that as Raymond had served a sentence of almost 20 years for Pamela's murder, when the minimum tariff had been 16 years, that he should be considered for parole. Until this point, as Raymond had continued to insist he was innocent, he would not be considered for parole. And then finally, on the 30th of August 2007, when Raymond was 45 years old, his conviction was quashed by 3 appeal judges at the High Court of Appeal in Edinburgh, who had declared the original verdict unsafe after hearing important and significant evidence in the case. However, Raymond and his family wouldn't be celebrating just yet, as after hearing the verdict, Raymond was then taken back to prison where he was serving a 30-month sentence for indecent exposure, an offence he committed after being released on parole, having never received any counselling or support for his sexual inadequacies and behaviours. Upon hearing the verdict, Raymond's mum, Christine, who had supported Raymond throughout, said, "It has been a long wait, but we got what we asked for. It has been very tough all these years, but I have never had any doubt he was innocent." In the years since Raymond's conviction has been quashed, while other murderers, such as Scottish serial killer and paedophile Robert Black and British convicted serial killer and sex offender Peter Tobin, have been linked to Pamela Hastie's murder, Pamela's murder is still unsolved and likely to stay that way if what Raymond's solicitor Gordon Ritchie said in the Glasgow Times on the 22nd of March 2018 is true, that in order for the police to reopen the case, they have to accept the officers lied, going on to say that there is a real sense of frustration that the crime has not been solved 35 years on, saying that in the years since Raymond had been released, the police have done nothing to try and find out who actually committed this crime. Well, that was in 2018, we're now in 2022, and still no further forward. 39 years after Pamela's brutal and shocking rape and murder. So again, another story where so many lives have been destroyed. Firstly, of course, Pamela has been murdered, and her murderer has not been brought to justice. Pamela's parents have had their 16-year-old daughter so brutally taken away from them, and thought for so long that her murderer was in prison, only for their wounds to be opened again upon it being discovered that Raymond's conviction was unsafe. Raymond was 19 years old when he was wrongly convicted of Pamela's murder, only getting his conviction quashed when he was 45 years old, and he is still haunted by his years in prison for a crime he did not commit. And Raymond's mother has had to put her life on hold and fight hard to have her son, who was completely innocent of Pamela's murder, finally get an appeal and be released. And all because a detective superintendent had a 100% clean-up rate and decided that Raymond would fit the bill nicely. Some of you may even think that Raymond got what was coming to him, due to him indecently exposing himself to young girls and women. But just remember, 16-year-old Pamela Hastie was brutally raped and murdered by being strangled. Someone did that. Someone has got away with that. Neither Pamela or her family have received justice. Why did the man who brutally raped and killed Pamela Hastie get to potentially live a full and healthy life, and may even still be living it? What if Pamela's murderer went on to kill again? Why did Pamela's murderer not deserve to face justice? And why are there no consequences for the actions taken that lead to a miscarriage of justice? Now, while I spoke to Ewan and Kathy from the charity Miscarriages of Justice organisation in Scotland, there are an abundance of other charities out there that are fighting every day for victims of miscarriages of justice. I've included a selection of such organisations that I've become aware of, and you can find them on the Scottish Murders website under the Raymond Gilmour episode. Like Kathy said, a miscarriage of justice could happen to anyone in any walk of life. So I hope you've taken away from the Miscarriage of Justice Month more of an awareness about miscarriages of justice, as well as the many organisations that are out there that will support you should you ever find yourself in that position. Thank you so much for listening to Scottish Murders Miscarriage of Justice Month. I hope you found it as interesting and eye-opening as I did. Before I go, just to let you know about the theme for August. Scottish Murders will be taking a break from the normal episodes in August, and instead will be releasing previous short Patreon bonus episodes, as well as playing a couple of other podcasts episodes. We hope you will enjoy the slight change to August's episodes. Also, I am going to be visiting my hometown of Oban, and so I'll be posting on social media regularly with pictures and videos of what I'm up to while I'm there. If you don't follow Scottish Murders on social media, you can find us on Twitter at Scottish Murders, on Instagram at Scottish Murders Podcast, and on Facebook at Scottish Murders, MURDURS.
Scottish Scottish Murders is a production of Cluarantonn.